Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Terry Maroney, who is a distinguished professor of law at Vanderbilt University and a foundational voice in law and emotion scholarship. Her work has been truly seminal for the field. Already 20 years ago, she published a taxonomy when law and emotion scholarship was still emerging and often viewed quite critically. And in this paper, she provided one of the first systematic approaches how to study emotion and law and set out an influential agenda for scholarship. In the years since, in her own research, she turned particular attention to judicial emotions and judicial behavior, demonstrating that emotions are an integral part of human cognition and legal reasoning. Through many important works, ranging from the concept of common emotional sense to judicial anger, she has explored how the emotional life of judges shape legal argumentation and decision-making. Today, she will build on this research by addressing the relationship between emotions and judicial behavior once more. And we are very happy to have you here and to have you as a speaker of our inaugural keynote speech for our conference. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Professor Terry Maroney.
Thank you so much for the extremely warm welcome. I am truly touched, and I'm truly touched that so many people have come today. And I'm especially honored to have the opportunity to share with you my perspective on judicial emotion. So I'd like to start with a quote from a United States federal trial judge who I will call Jay. And Jay is a middle-aged gentleman. He's the sort of person who wears a suit and tie almost everywhere he goes. Soft-spoken, even-keeled, politically very moderate, so not at all the kind of image you might conjure up if you were to read a newspaper headline that says, "Emotional judge decides case," you know. So, but yet, as Jay, in his very soft-spoken, even-keeled way, sat and talked with me one afternoon, he said, you know, just because I have a black robe on doesn't mean I don't have emotions like everybody else. And the same is true of every single judge I have ever met, and the same is true of every single judge on the entire planet Earth. And so this is what I study, what judges feel, what judges do with what they feel, and why that matters, including to all of us. So for some of you, I imagine when you saw the title of my talk, you cocked your head to the side a little bit. You said, what is that? This may be the first time you've ever heard of somebody studying such a thing. So there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is both here in Europe and back in the United States, we've all been acculturated to this idea that I call the persistent cultural script of judicial dispassion. And the script of judicial dispassion has been articulated in many ways over the centuries. My favorite is from Thomas Hobbes, 1651, in Leviathan, where he just stated it bluntly, and he said, a good judge, and here I'm quoting, must divest himself of all fear, hatred, love, and compassion. So this script, the reason I call it the persistent cultural script of judicial dispassion is because it has gotten sticky. It has stuck with us, even coming through almost unscathed into the current century. Just as an example, in the United States, Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the Supreme Court and her ideological opposite, Justice Antonin Scalia of the Supreme Court, both have paid homage to the script of dispassion. Her a little unwillingly, him quite enthusiastically, but still the endorsement. So Sotomayor said in 2009 that while judges are not robots and they do have emotions, they have to take those emotions and put them aside. And Scalia wrote just a year before that, and I'm going to quote him directly here, good judges pride themselves on the rationality of their rulings and the suppression of their personal proclivities, including, most especially, their emotions. So the script of judicial dispassion is not subscript, it is literal and it is clear. It is the text, right? So similar scripts form the background in a great many other countries. Excellent research in Australia and in Sweden, for example, has shown the exact same pattern. And so given this anti-emotion cultural bias, discussing judicial emotion is countercultural. Trying to understand it is seen as quixotic, and trying to at least partially defend it seems crazy. And yet here I am. And part of why I am here is that all over the world, the script of dispassion is cracking. And it's cracking for a very specific reason. It's cracking because the anachronistic ideas about emotion that undergird it are themselves cracking. There's an interdisciplinary international group of scholars, including me, that a few years ago wrote a piece in Nature, Human Behavior. And we asserted in that paper that we are all now living in the age of effectivism. Psychology, neuroscience, economics, philosophy, sociology, even popular culture, they all reject this old view of emotion as inherently inscrutable, irrational, untamable. Instead, we now recognize that emotions are a core human capacity. They affect our well-being, but they also shape our behavior, and they also drive core cognitive faculties such as attention, learning, memory. Right, so through emotions, we experience the world, we understand the world, we navigate the world, we build connection with other people, we communicate our needs, we pursue our goals. And emotions are vulnerable. They are just as vulnerable to error, to distortion as every other core human capacity, including intellect, but they're also just as sturdy. And while emotions are central to human life, it is a mistake to think of them as inherently good or inherently bad. As I'm going to hopefully win you over to the position today, emotions can do good or they can do bad, depending on what they are about and what we choose to do with them. And I hope I win you over because this very appropriately, let me say this differently, this appropriately complex contemporary understanding of emotion, it's begun to bubble up in law, but it has sea change potential to transform the way we think about judges and judging. So in my remaining time with you, I want to give you a little taste of what I mean by that. A fuller taste will hopefully be in print about a year from now in my forthcoming book, What Judges Feel, How Emotions Shape Justice. So perhaps I'll be able to come back and do a book signing for you. So here is your preview. So today I'm going to be focusing on what I know best, which is what I talk about in the book, which is the emotional lives of judges in the United States. I have spent the last decade with these judges. I have studied them through deep dive interviews, through anonymous surveys, and with cultural immersion in dozens upon dozens upon dozens of normally closed spaces of judicial reflection and dialogue. And also because we're kicking off this wonderful conference on emotions and universality in international law, I'm going to highlight what I see as universal and what I think is not universal about judicial emotion. So to begin, what I see as universal is the architecture within which judges experience and regulate the emotions that they inevitably feel in connection with their work. And, by the way, I have found that they have an incredible range of emotions. They get very irritated at lawyers. If you are a lawyer in the room, yeah, I was too. I get why they get irritated at us. They get very irritated at lawyers, especially if lawyers waste time. They get furious at lawyers who lie. They feel great joy when they're able to make the difference in somebody's life. For example, finalizing an adoption, presiding over a naturalization ceremony, giving a deserving person a second chance and seeing them succeed brings them great, great pleasure. They feel disappointment or sometimes even despair when the law forces them to participate in an injustice, which it sometimes does. Or when there's a big, big wrong which they just can't fix, which happens every day. Or where a ruling they really cared about and really thought was important to the way the country should function, when that gets overturned. Those things are quite devastating. Judges also feel quiet satisfaction, the satisfaction of doing a puzzle, right, cracking a really difficult legal issue. They often feel extreme boredom. A lot of law is very boring. A lot of judging is very boring. They sometimes feel loneliness. They are sitting there plowing through their pile of papers day after day. They can also feel like the Sisyphean task of they go through the pile of papers. The next day there's a bigger pile of papers, right? So it has somewhat of a relentless rhythm. And sometimes, and this is a particular danger in the United States right now, they feel scared because their lives are being threatened, or their children have been killed, or their families are having to live separately from them so they're not in danger. So with this range of emotions, what I found is that judges tend to keep a subliminal ledger. One of my interviewee judges called this the concept of psychic income. And in this psychic income ledger, all of these emotional ups and downs are kind of tallied, right side, left side, right? And the tally at the end of a day, a week, a lifetime, gives them a general sense of being okay or not being okay. So these emotions that may increase or drain a judge's psychic income may feel like they are happening to them. A lot of us feel that way about our emotions. Even the way we talk about emotions are they're things that happen to us and kind of live through us. But this is not a good way to think about emotions, because judges, like all humans, construct their emotions. They construct them from sensory perceptions, their interpretation of events, of those perceptions as constituting a certain type of event, the judgments they make about that type of event, and their judgments about whether it is important and whether it is either good or bad for them and for the people and things about which they care. So that's a lot. Let me give you a simple example of what I mean. So a judge named Susan sees a piece of evidence because a lawyer asks her to include it in the trial packet. Susan looks at the evidence and she identifies it as child pornography. And she hates to look at it because she hates what it means. She hates what it means for that child. She hates what it represents for all children, and she cares about these things. She doesn't know them, but she doesn't need to know them. She just cares about children and this one child, but also the others, right? So this is what the philosopher Martha Nussbaum has called emotions aboutness. This is what Susan's emotion is about, right? It's what psychologists call this an appraisal. And an appraisal is meant to transform a lot of complex thought and judgment and quickly deliver to us a subjective interpretation of the personal significance of events, right? So every single emotion experienced by every single person on the planet, I believe, is built on a foundation like this. It is what our emotions are about. So our minds can assemble this package of aboutness very, very fast. It can do it well below the level of declarative consciousness, and it's doing that on purpose so we can use that information in real life in real time. But also it can happen very consciously. It can happen over time. So the example that came to my mind on this is, I'm sure we've all been in this situation where you have sort of an ambiguous or slightly weird conversation with a friend, and then you spend a lot of time afterwards trying to figure out what was going on and whether your friend was being really, really friendly or whether they were being passive aggressive. And you might really work through all the details and the evidence pro and con, and decide, and depending on what conclusion you come to, you either feel affectionate warmth or you feel really, really irritated, right? So again, it can happen in a flash. It can happen over months as you gather data, and the aboutness kind of stitch itself together. But that's, even if it happens in a flash, that is the process that's going on under the hoods. And that is true for judges, just like it's true for all of us. Okay, so that's kind of the thought part. That's the part of emotions are built from thoughts. But emotions are not only thoughts. Emotions are thoughts that live through the body. If the body were not engaged, they would be just thoughts, but they're not, right? So what gives emotions their signature power, the way they feel, the way we even bother to think of them as a category of human experience, is the way they engage the body. So again, imagine Susan looking at this piece of child pornography. Her body is already responding in multiple ways that might help her cope with a situation like this. They might not, more on that anon, but it's meant to kind of prime her for the kinds of things that might be helpful in a situation like this. So Susan might recoil, right? She might cover her mouth, she might close her eyes, she might curl her lips, she might gasp, she might groan, right? So these bodily states and the movements and the sounds that they entail, they call her attention, they combine with the aboutness, and they tell her what is happening and what she thinks about it. They tell her what she feels. The body is also integrating and sending internal signals about what is happening and the way in which it matters. And if you asked her how she feels, Susan would use a specific feeling word that she has learned to associate with this very specific way in which thoughts and body are interacting. She might say, I feel repulsed, I feel disgusted. And if she were around other people, and other people knew what she was looking at and saw the physicality, the sounds, the recoiling, whatever it is, she's sending them a signal too. And if those other people share a common set of understandings about the situation, if they also share a common understanding of what emotions sound like and look like, if they have also learned a similar emotional lexicon, they will also know what she feels. And so she's sending herself information and she's sending other situations. She's sending others information, sorry. So I've used the word if a lot in that last sentence. There are a lot of clauses. A lot of them were preceded by the word if, right? So anytime I'm talking about the if, I'm sort of tipping you off that I'm about to talk about variation, right? So here comes all the variation. So the architecture, which is what I've just been describing, this architecture for how judges build their emotions through this integration of mind and body, I do believe that that is as close to universal as we get. But the content is not. The content is where all the variation comes in, and it's a lot of variation, right? The content of judges' emotions can vary for lots of different reasons. I'm going to give you just a few. And the first one is that judges are exposed to really different stimuli. All of this is about us perceiving things, interpreting things, judging things, and acting in accordance with what we think those things demand of us. And judges are not getting the same stimuli, right? A family court judge who's hearing bitter custody disputes is going to have a different emotional diet, is being fed different things than, say, an appellate judge who is regularly handling technological patent disputes, or a judge, apropos of this conference, a judge on the European Court of Human Rights who's hearing allegations of racial discrimination. These are not the same things, right? Some judges will be lucky enough never to see a piece of child pornography, and some of them will see them every single week, or unfortunately sometimes every day. The diets are different, the inputs are different. The second reason why judges' emotions vary so much is that even if they have the same stimuli, they will perceive, interpret, and evaluate them differently based on their worldviews. A lot goes into a worldview. Life experiences, sociocultural positioning, political ideology, cultural learning, core ideas of what's right and wrong. Anything that shapes a judge's worldview will shape their emotions. The child pornography example is a relatively simple one because most judges, one hopes, will share Susan's appraisal of it, right? And they will also share her disgust, and they won't have to think about it, right? That's going to be one of those reactions that happens in a flash, and it will happen to most people, because most people will regard it as repulsive and disgusting because they share the thought process behind it. So if a lot of judges are feeling a lot of the same things, which they are, much of the time, this is not because emotions are universal, it's because their underlying appraisals are the same. And that is often not the case. In a great many other instances, the underlying appraisals are not the same, right? So pick any hot-button legal issue, abortion, same-sex marriage, tariffs, it's very hot on my mind these days, right? And judges' emotions are going to be exactly as diverse as their worldviews. So judicial emotion can seem perhaps like it's universal because we are mistaking the appraisal being shared in many situations for a natural category that is universal, and that is a mistake. So the point goes even further. The affective cultural psychologist Bacha Mesquita, for example, has shown that people who grow up and have affective experiences and lexicons that are shaped by very different cultures, as many of us in this room, that's true of many of us, right? So if we're raised in a very different emotional culture that supplies us different concepts of emotion, different types of emotion, different words for emotion, we will have different emotions, partly because we're filling in the architecture differently. But Dr. Mesquita's gone even further and said, and it's possible actually that our architectures are even somewhat different. And that people from wildly different cultures from one another, one culture may recognize an emotion that has no cognate in a different culture. And her examples are, for example, the very, very specific type of coziness that the Dutch call gezellig, and the pleasurable, painful experience of dependent nurturing that is known in Japan as amae. So, to paraphrase Anais Nin, we do not feel things as they are. We feel things as we are. And that's true of all of us, and it's true of judges. So, this is a tiny little mini sum up in the middle. So, emotions, I'm arguing to you, should be understood as tight packages of embodied thoughts that are indelibly shaped by context. And common contextual variance will come from the types of cases judges are called on to adjudicate, and the personal, social, political, and cultural contexts that have shaped their worldviews. All of that is, how do we understand what judges feel? And the second big question is, well, what do judges do with what they feel? So this formulation came to me when I was sitting in an early interview with a very thoughtful judge named Daniel. And Daniel was unusual, and he was unusual because over the years of being a judge, he'd become extremely open and very comfortable with the wide range of emotions he felt that he experienced in his work, right? And yet, even for somebody who was at the very far end of that emotional comfort continuum, he was still confused. And he looked at me and he said, you know what's confusing though? What's confusing is what you're supposed to do with those emotions as a judge. So there's a reason for that confusion too. And part of the reason for that confusion is that judges are given two slightly differing, not that much, but slightly differing commands. Put emotion aside or suppress it. So the problem with that, the problem with those messages is both of those things are hard things to do and practically impossible, right? And yet they're told to do it as if it's easy. And everyone's like, okay, put it aside. Nobody knows what that means and nobody knows how to do it, right? So that's one pretty big problem. The second really big problem is that sometimes even if we could do that, it's the wrong thing to do, right? So you would not want, for example, Susan to lose her capacity to feel disgusted and repulsed by child pornography. That would be a sign that something has gotten shaken loose or frozen over, right? You don't want the judge who doesn't care about things about which they should care. And so not only, again, are they getting bad instructions, but they're getting a bad destination. So it's a bad combination. Either of those things would be pretty bad together. They're pretty deadly. So here's another universal part. And the other universal part is every single judge on the planet does something with their emotions. We just often don't know what, and they often don't know what either, right? So that something, whatever it is what the psychologist James Gross calls emotion regulation. And because I'm talking about it in the context of judicial work, it's an example of what the sociologist Arlie Hochschild famously called emotional labor. Right, so judges, whether they realize it or not, whether they know what they're doing or not, even if they can't explain it or not, and this is a really interesting thing that I found in my study, judges are so articulate, and if they tell me about an emotion and I say, well, what'd you do with that? They'll just be like, I don't know. Or if they'll say, well, I went and I did this, I said, how did you get from A to B? What was the process from A to B? They'll say, I have no idea, right? And it's not because they're uniquely, sort of dense. I do not think that at all. I think it's because the culture, judicial culture, and outside culture's pressure on the judiciary disincentivizes them to understand and to interrogate. I remember a judge I talked to once just started laughing and said, when she was telling me just how out of touch she is with her emotions and how she thinks her family probably would back her up on saying that. And she said, you know what it is? She said, I'm supposed to be emotionless, I'm supposed to be dispassionate, so there's no point in me thinking about that emotion that I'm not going to feel right now, right? So we're giving very counterproductive messages. But they still are doing something with their emotions because there is literally no other way to live, right? One can't live unless one does. So they are doing things to try to shape what they feel when they feel it and the expression of those feelings, right? So to me, this is kind of like the Holy Grail. Like, can we get a grip not only on what our judges are feeling, but how are they regulating them? I'll give you some examples, and all the examples I'm about to say are things that judges have actually told me that they do, right? So let's go back to Susan. So for example, let's say that when Susan is looking at this piece of child pornography, she's alone in her chambers. So one thing she might do is just turn it over. She might turn it over, buy herself a little bit of time, distract the brain a little bit. She may give herself a little talking to. I've heard judges give them, and they'll tell me, okay, I'll say to myself, and sometimes they're real mean to themselves, the way that we all can be. Sometimes they're gentler. But she may give herself kind of a little talking to about why it's important that she look, that this is part of what she signed up for, that there's a job that has to be done, and then maybe she can find it within herself to turn it over. She may, while she's got it turned over, she may also just try to consciously adopt what one of my interviewees once called like an academic mode. She said, I'm just going to click into like academic mode, and I'm going to think, what is the information I am to, pull out of this thing, and I will pull out that information and then I can turn it over, right? So kind of putting herself almost in an engineering kind of or medical mindset, like here's a disgusting, horrible thing and I need to extract useful information from it and then I'm done. Or Susan might not do any of those things. She might put her head down and cry. She might go into the restroom to cry so her clerks won't hear her. She might go take a long walk and come back and give it another whirl and see if she can make herself look at it this time. Now imagine that she's at home, because this is also something that happens. Judges have so much work, they often take things home. So she might be home and open the evidence packet and realize what she's got. A judge who was telling me about this exact same situation said, I opened this thing and my kids were asleep upstairs and I just thought I have brought infection into my home and I need it to go away. I can't live with this here and my kids there. So Susan might do what this judge did, which is she may slam it shut, put it in her briefcase, go outside, put it in the trunk of her car, lock the car, and go back inside and hug her kids. And then finally, if Susan's in court, she might put on just a poker face or a stone face. One judge famously, in my surveys, called it his dead face. So she might put on a poker face and just try to model professional detachment, which is particularly important for her to do as a woman because female judges get penalized for showing emotion. If she were to show compassion or sadness, some people would judge her as too soft. If she were to show anger, they might see her as shrill, right? Studies show that powerful women and powerful men who express the same levels of anger, for the men it cements their authority, and for women it erodes it. So Susan's got a lot of choices to make, and they're different choices with different implications. And the last layer here is judges also have to attend to their country or their region's emotional culture. So these are the powerful norms that define how people are generally expected to feel and to display their feelings. And they can be very, very different. I've split my adult life between New York City and the American South. I assure you they are very different emotional cultures. Right? And studies back this up. So judges in Sweden, for example, two wonderful sociologists in Sweden have done terrific work here. And they found that judges in Sweden are operating against a very restrained emotional culture. That is part of being Swedish, what is understood to be Swedish. And so when they are very irritated or angry at a lawyer and they want to express that, they usually take notes. They calmly put down their pen. And everyone's like, ooh, you know, where in the US, I'm sorry to say, nobody would notice the pen. It would be a signal that would be lost by all, right? You know, the US judges are much more likely to raise an eyebrow, to go like this, to roll their eyes. And unfortunately, as I found out when I researched this article called Angry Judges and sent my research assistants out onto the internet, they yell a lot, they throw things. Sometimes they even challenge lawyers to fist fights and then go outside the courtroom and beat them. This has happened. The one who did that did get removed from the bench. Just there's that. There's, you know, some small blessings, right? Okay, so but judges are making all these complicated choices about the exact situation they're in, about the sort of penumbra of what their goals are in that situation, how they want to manage their courtroom, how they want to manage their impression that others have of them, and all of that is happening within this broader cultural context, right? And the last piece here is judges also have longer-term coping challenges that they have to confront. So, for example, those terrible images of the child pornography may now be stuck in Susan's head. So many judges told me about this. One of them called it a psychic wound that you just walk around with. And another one just shook his head and he like this and said, there is no scrubbing mechanism for this stuff, right? So you've got to figure out what to do about that. Susan might talk to a therapist, as some judges have, or as some other judges have told me, she might mentally try to put the images in a box, lock the box, put the box on a shelf, and walk away and never open it again. Right, so this is the second mini summation. So with emotional regulation, with the emotional labor, as opposed to the emotions themselves, right? So to the extent that judges believe themselves to be in different situations, or that they have different values and goals, or will be evaluated by different rubrics and standards, and operate in different emotional climates, not only may their emotions be different, but what they do with them will also be different. So if you put these things together, I believe that this understanding of what judges feel and what they do with what they feel allows us to break open what has historically been a black box, right? Judges' emotions and their emotional labors may be experienced as simple and natural and automatic, but they are complex, they are constructed, and they are constrained. They are a direct window into what judges think, what they care about, what they're trying to do, and how they're trying to accommodate multiple and often conflicting demands. So one of my interviewees said to me once when I was talking to him somewhat casually about why he wanted to take part in my study, and he said, you know, it is important to know our judges, who we are, how we think, what motivates us, because those are things that factor into every single decision we make, big or small. So I think if we collectively put a judge's emotions to the side, we miss out on a crucial portal for that knowledge. And we should not set it aside. We should go into that portal and see what do we see. So this perspective, I believe, is universal, right? It goes directly against the script of dispassion. But the better we understand it, the better we understand this new perspective on emotion and through it a new perspective on judicial emotion, the better off we all are. And there are three reasons that I'll say to close. The first reason is that what judges feel and what they do with what they feel has an impact on them as people, right? Their mental and physical health, their stress, their professional longevity, their burnout, their cynicism levels, right? We have a social obligation, I believe, to help judges cultivate the emotional awareness and habits of emotional labor that will help them cope most productively over the long term. Judges should be changed by their work. That's inevitable, but they should not be disfigured by their work. They should not be destroyed by it. And if they are, they destroy us, right? So it is also in our collective self-interest as healthy judges. As yet another one of my interviewees said to me, healthy judges make for healthy courts. The second reason is that when judges are emotionally self-aware and skilled at their emotional labor, they treat people better. They treat lawyers better, jurors, witnesses, the press, members of the public. And as the psychologist Tom Tyler has shown, when people feel treated well by a judge, they have greater respect for and faith in the legal system as a whole. And we need that. We need that so much right now, and clearly in the United States, where polls show that respect for the courts is at a historic low. And then finally, judges' emotions will matter sometimes to who wins and who loses and why. We can say it's not so, but it just is. And that fact is universal, but the way in which it operationalizes in any given instance is not. So the great philosopher Robert Solomon once said, quote, "One cannot have a sense of justice without the capacity and willing to be personally outraged." And one of my interviewees, who, interestingly enough, the same judge who said, "I'm so invested in being dispassionate that I'm not paying attention to the emotion I'm not going to have right now," right? So she's really buying into trying to obey the script. At a much later point in the interview, she said something that was exactly opposite. I think lost on her, but not on me. And she said, she was telling me about something that made her really, really angry in her courtroom and how she expressed it. And then she said, "I don't want to get rid of that. I want to retain my capacity for anger because I want to be able to see and respond to an injustice. And if I lose that, I'm done." So this particular judge had her own ideas about what constitutes an injustice, and other judges will have polar opposite ideas of what is justice and what is injustice, right? And how a judge responds to what they see as an injustice will also be bound by what they think they can and should show and do in their role as a judge. So the universals and the variations are always in a complex dance, just as emotion is always in a complex dance with all the other inputs and processes that we're having in our minds and our bodies. So, are judges' emotions universal or varied? Yes. Are they good or are they bad? Yes. And do they matter? Absolutely yes. So thank you so much for listening. I very much look forward to this conversation. Thank you. Shall I sit?
Thank you for this wonderful talk. I think it provides an excellent foundation for the discussion that will now follow. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our two discussants this evening. First, I would like to welcome Professor Jonas Benz. He is Professor of Anthropology at Hamburg University. Trained in both law and anthropology, his work is situated at the intersection of these two disciplines. His research explores how humans navigate and negotiate conflicting moral, legal, and cultural ideas. Many of you will, of course, be familiar with his book, The Sentimental Court, a very important contribution to international socio-legal scholarship. In it, focusing on the International Criminal Court, he shows how affect plays a crucial role in international criminal law by helping to legitimize its normative claims. Through extensive ethnographic fieldwork, he offers a critical analysis of how emotions are actively produced and mobilized in legal processes. Having listened to Professor Maroney's talk on judicial emotions on the national level, we are very happy that Professor Benz can be here with us today with his expertise on the effective lives of international courts. And of course, I am delighted to also welcome Professor Anne Peters as our second discussant this evening. Many of you, of course, already know her, as she is the director of the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law here in Heidelberg. She is, of course, also the convener of this conference on international law and emotions. Anne Peters is widely recognized for her pioneering work on global animal law and global constitutionalism, and always critically reflecting on the state of the world and of international law. She has recently launched a new research project exploring the role of emotions in international law. We are very fortunate to have you both here as our discussants.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Caroline, for the kind introduction. Thank you for the wonderful talk, and I think you should start the discussion and lead the discussion because you, after all, are the expert and our guest.
Yes, you should see what my copy of your book looks like. In fact, I brought it, so I'll show it to you tomorrow. It's every page has a sticky on it and posted, and I've written all over it. It's a wonderful piece of work.
Oh my, yeah, that's putting the bar pretty high. So thank you so much for this this kind entry. I just wanted to say that I have very much been looking forward to this conversation, because when I started first to think about the relationship of law and emotion, I think one of the first things I read was your foundational article from about, I don't know,
20 years
20
ago.
years
Yeah.
ago, 2006.
It was the first paper I ever wrote as an academic. So I've been downhill.
Yeah, it has become quite influential, as we all know. It's called, in case you would like to have a look at it, it's called Law and Emotion, a taxonomy of an emerging field, or something like that. And I think it has influenced me very much. And yeah, I'm really looking forward, or have been looking forward to talking with you. Maybe I wanted to discuss with you a little bit of what you have talked to us today, and what I particularly am interested in as an anthropologist is what you laid out in your talk, what is universal about emotions and what is particular about it. And I think this has been always the anthropological interest on emotion. So is this something that everybody has? You know, have all people certain understandings of love or hate? Or is this like very culturally specific? And particularly since the 80s, there's a lot of discussion going on, because in psychology there was always this idea of basic emotions, and we have a very much like natural science approach to emotions. And anthropologists have always tried to criticize the overly universalistic approach of some emotion psychology. And I think you picked up on this very much, and I think it's very clear that we all have emotions, we all have bodies, we all feel, but as we grow up in very different circumstances, share certain cultural values and others not, it's clear that there's also so much difference. Of course, as you have pointed out for the US, of course, inside societies, the same as in between them. Yeah. And I think that's fantastic. And I wanted to discuss with you also then another level, because we have now talked so much about like focusing on judges as individuals and their emotions, right? And I think something when we talk about international law, we are of course also very much interested, I guess, in the collective dimension of emotions. And that is where I wanted to hear your take on it, because as you lay out so nicely in your talk, when we come from this like perception of emotions that you have talked about, the collective aspect comes in at the moment of these appraisals. Yeah, so we have these normative orders, legal orders, values, these normative orders that tell us what is right and what is wrong, and they are of course shared and collective, but people adhere to them very differently. They switch between them. Something in anthropology we call normative pluralism, legal pluralism. And then of course, and then we have like these abstract, let's say abstract normative orders are the collective thing, and then they enter the body. I think you used even this term, right? They enter the body and become an emotional response. And I'm wondering, don't you think also that we have to talk or to discuss a little more about these collective emotions? I'm talking about political atmospheres, political moods, and I'm thinking about what we are discussing in international law, yeah, that and particularly in international law, we don't have these powerful individual lawmakers, right?
We now have one.
Yes, of course. Yeah, well, if he's a lawmaker, that's the question. But I think it is much more like very diffuse collective processes of negotiations, where really moods in the room play a big role, and in the US we can also see that we have large, and in Europe of course, large political atmospheres of where values are shifting to the right, and in this instance, so. That's what I'm curious about. Yeah. What is your take on this collective dimension of emotion?
Everything you said, yes. Just yes to all of that. Let me pick out some of the things, the wonderful points you raised, kind of in order. And first, I do think it's important to talk about the extreme individualistic universalist take that characterized most early affective psychology, which fortunately is no longer in favor. But when I first started studying emotion, which is, again, 22-ish years ago, I confess that I thought those theories were terrific, and I think I thought, all this stuff about universal expressions of emotion in the face, and you show them in Borneo and people recognize them. Not true, by the way, but I think I liked them because they were simple. They were truthy, like they captured something very, very, very important, which is there is a lot of universality, again, I think at this level of the architecture, and then it's skated over the rest. And so I think that just as thinking people, it's easy to like best the theory that explains the most, even if it's not quite right. And so the more I've learned, the more complex it is. And in my talk just now, I just gave you maybe 2 or 3 ways in which that complexity comes in, but you're completely right. There's so many more, right? So many more, and that can make messaging hard. It can make understanding hard. It's like too many variables. It's kind of like my big quarrel with most of the quantitative study of judicial behavior that dominates in my field in law, is people pick two variables, right? They pick the political party of the president who nominated a judge, and then they pick their ultimate outcomes in a small set of disputed legal opinions, and they try to see how much the one predicts the other. Shocker, politics matters sometimes, right? But it's taking a whole complex human reality and it's shrinking it down almost to meaninglessness in my mind. So, and what I like about the anthropological take and the cultural psychological take is that we embrace the complexity. So that was just one. On the collective, 100% on that as well. So especially in the talk I gave just now, I was talking very much about judges as individuals. But I do also talk about judges as a collective, though I think that's probably what I'm going to try to study more specifically next. In the U.S. system, it's very different because most trial judges really do roll solo. I mean, they're undergirded by a huge network of staff, right? They don't really roll solo, but they do decide solo. And so that's a very different task, and the only judges who decide things as a group are our intermediate and ultimate appellate courts. So the main place this shows up in my research is studying appellate judges, and there's a whole chapter, fortunately, on them. But if you talk to appellate judges about where a lot of their difficult emotional experiences are, it's with each other, right? The trial judges will be like, it's totally the child pornography, it's the this, it's the everybody who comes before me has these massive, socioeconomic problems that are the root of everything, and I don't get to do anything about that, so I just churn them through, The appellate judges are like, it's really, really hard just to decide things with people who all think they're really, right.
Yeah, can I
Please.
ask a follow-up question? Because in international law, as you said, we're dealing mostly with collective actors. For
Yes.
example, the state. So we ascribe, the state...
You have to anthropomorphize
right.
it. Yeah.
And of course, you did not study such collective bodies, but would you think it makes sense to speak of the emotion of the chamber, of judges, for example?
I think you could talk about the emotional culture of a chamber. I mean, even if you talk to trial judges, again, they're all still in a court, and that court has a culture. Like, for example, Daniel, the judge who said, that he was confused about what to do with his emotions, he said he remembers very clearly that when he joined his court, he started having all these emotional challenges and difficulties that were new to him, and he just knew that that was not something you talked about with the other judges. He knew that that was a solo endeavor to figure that out. He just knew, because that's how culture works, right? It's just the rules of where you are. And I've talked to other judges in other places with different emotion cultures, and they're like, oh no, we just started right away, we have lunch together, we're all like, oh my God, can't believe that happened, So they're always in a culture, and when they're actually deciding together, then they create microcultures. you know, I clerked on a federal appellate court, and so I kind of lived through this, because you get randomly assigned these panels, and it's 3 judges. Yeah, it's like a weird little algorithm, right? It's like, oh, who are the other 2 going to be? Like, you know, it's the unique combination of those 3 personalities is a thing. It's a microculture, and it changes things. Like, it actually changes how opinions are written. It changes what gets decided, right? So I'm very fascinated by this. And then the last thing I'll say about this is, I think we don't talk enough about collective emotion generally, sort of like collective effervescence, the way that things literally feel different when they're felt collectively as opposed to individually.
Maybe can I follow up on that also with you, Professor Benz, because you've studied an international court,
Yes.
so the bench is international. So how much do you think does that, creating this microculture of the collective body, how much does the different background then of the, especially the national background and their upbringing in a different culture matter? Because all the international collective actors that we study in international law, they're also typically multinational. So is that important? I guess it is important,
Of
but
course,
how
yeah.
and in which way? Yeah.
How?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, I also didn't write a kind of book that was focusing so much on judges for the International Criminal Court. Also, it's not so easy to access that. But I think that definitely the international composition of the International Criminal Court creates a lot of awareness for these things, much more than in national courts, because people are very aware that they come from, first of all, very different professional backgrounds, different legal systems. So they verbalize a lot of the potential misunderstandings that they could have. And you can see that also when you look at trials. People are constantly, much more than in national courts, I would assume, switch into the meta level and talk about, you know, I as a, for example, in the case that I observed, the presiding judge was German, and then he was constantly saying, yeah, this is something that maybe is a common law, continental law thing, and he was constantly like, and there is
So there's
Schmidt,
transparency about the friction points or the
exactly,
differences.
and there is also something in sociology. People talk about emotional reflexivity, right?
Yes.
And you were mentioning this idea that we have this age of affectivity, and I think there's a lot of talk about emotion also on the meta level. In like public discourses, and that of course is something that is then a very present topic in these courts. And I think there are 2 kinds of collective dimension that come here. You were talking about the microcultures of like a chamber like this, like 3 judges in the International Criminal Court, for instance, in a trial chamber. And of course there are certain dynamics between these individual people, and I think we know all far more than we ever wanted to know about the United States Supreme Court judges and how that, you know, and what their backgrounds and their family histories, and there seems also to be the very strong idea that you can really, you know, you really micro target these people and then you make a big difference. And I think it's definitely true, but there is also another kind of collective that we also probably do not know enough about, is that courts, and I would assume also the US Supreme Court, react also to much larger collective atmospheres and moods, you know? Like the mood in the country. And they are thinking a lot about how this will be received, emotionally received by publics. And these kinds of public emotions are probably also very important to understand judging. And in international law, it's very clear that we have rapid changes in like moods in international communities, and it's obvious that this plays a big role. And for Trump, obviously, on a daily basis.
Yes, and the standing of the international courts is, of course, much weaker, roughly speaking, than the domestic ones. They have to be much more careful because they must be aware every instance that member states will cut the funding or whatever.
Yeah, and they'll be, you know, they're always being accused of, you know, anything they
Activism,
do being
politicized,
political, and
yeah.
because in the popular lexicon, political and emotional are often conflated. So if they do show or communicate any emotion in an opinion, the way they write it, for example, people will latch onto that and say, you see, it's biased, it's subjective, it's blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I don't know, we can maybe also open to questions of the audience, but I don't know exactly, Ms. Jung,
Yeah, we can't
how are we
see.
gonna organize
I can't
this?
see you really.
So is there
I got you. Yes, we have an additional mic here.
Oh,
so,
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
And now we can see.
Hi, thank you so much. Kelly Drubgo, Associate Professor of Government at William and Mary in Virginia, so in the States. I had a question for Professor Maroney about the idea of emotional regulation and increasing use of therapy. I'm wondering if you've seen in your work or others of your colleagues some generational variation, and does that enhance outcomes because people are more aware of what they're feeling, positive outcomes, I mean, or maybe the other way, because perhaps people allow themselves, judges, to feel too much. That was a first question. And the second question, excuse me, was about when emotion is explicitly brought in. I'm thinking of sentencing and the idea of judicial mercy. And, you know, if people are, you know, these constellations of experiences, background, et cetera, and have different ranges, has there been work on the extent to which differently positioned judges are able to be merciful or not? Especially I'm thinking, you know, like in light of testimonies by affected relatives, for example, and they're bringing that into the courtroom, and that's supposed to, you know, enhance the sentence, or maybe for those seeking restorative justice to reduce it or to mitigate it. Thanks.
Yeah, those are terrific questions. I will give them, unfortunately, rather short shrift, but I think we're going to have more time to talk to each other, which is good. So on the first one, absolutely on generational change. It's very dramatic, actually, within judicial culture. And, you know, the older school judges will say, like, well, these new judges, they're much more comfortable with talking about this stuff. We wouldn't have talked about it back in my day. And one thing, especially on the federal bench, because people were there for such a long time, I was able to talk to a lot of people who have seen the generational change and have also changed a little bit along with it. You know, like I'm thinking of one quite senior judge who saw a colleague go through a horrible, horrible emotional experience where a trial where, like, in his words, everybody had to go to therapy. The court paid for all the jurors to go to therapy and the judge. And I said, well, did you approach him about it or ask him how he was or offer him any support? He said, oh God, no, I would never have done that then. I would do it now. Right, so the generational change is huge. I also remember one judge who, in a relatively small place, who started having panic attacks on the bench, which was profoundly mortifying, and his, you know, clerks had to try to pass it off like he was having a different kind of medical incident. And so he decided to go seek mental health care, but he drove like 100 miles, like to a completely different part of his state to go see. It made me think of like Tony Soprano going to see Dr. Melfi in a place where nobody would see him. It was just like, that's how it was then, and it's not like that now. So I think it's been a very dramatic change. You know, and now that I have a lot of negative things I could say about the trend towards talking about judicial wellness. I think judicial wellness is like the hot topic right now, especially in judicial education in the States. I'm involved in that. I think it's great. I also think that it's a real danger that when I say I'm talking about judicial emotion, people only think wellness. It's a little aggravating, truthfully. Like, no, it's that and other things. But the trend to attending to judicial wellness has pretty much been an unmitigated good, except for my bee in my bonnet about how that's not the only thing emotion is. The second question, the short answer is that no, I mean, nobody has studied any of this, let alone look to try to track kind of the outcomes. What I offer in my book, and I'm not trying to make a lot of causal claims. This is like very, like, you know, what Kristen Luker called the logic of discovery, not the logic of quantification. Trying to understand the range of emotions, not to say, and this is invariably the effect they have. So what I do have, though, and I'd love to talk about this more, is I specifically with sentencing, I'm able to, from the judges I interviewed, show diametrically opposed use of emotions in exactly the way you said in one instance to show tremendous compassion, and to basically be so moved by a situation of like moving heaven and earth to find a way to not have this particular person go to prison at all, which made prosecutors very angry. And in another situation, a different judge listening to some emotional victim testimony and being like, God, that guy's right. I've been thinking of this too clinically, and this was really bad. Like, you literally cheated this old guy out of like every cent he had, and he's cutting his medicine in half. I'm going to give extra time to this guy. And so my position, so it can go either way. And my position is not to say that one is good and one is bad. Actually, in both those instances, I actually thought both of what those guys did was good. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Leon Gruger is my name. I'm a student at Heidelberg University, and my question is for Professor Maroney. I question myself, what do you think are the goals that society is trying to achieve by demanding from judges that they should be emotionless? My hypothesis would be it's easier to assert authority and have acceptance of rulings when there's like this ideal of objectivity, and maybe also to have consistent and equal rulings. Yeah. And going from these goals, what do you think is a better way to achieve those?
I love you. That's really getting to the core of it. These questions are so good. I think that in the States, a lot of what the historical answer to your question is that the founders really, really bought into this narrative that being anti-emotion, meaning dispassionate, to be literally lack of passion, would generate extreme democratic goods, right? So dispassion was the key to things that are actually very important for a democratic society, like impartiality, lack of bias, treating similar situations the same, right? Treating different situations differently, having judgment, selling the idea of representative democracy, that ordinary citizens could become, for a moment, the face of the state, right? One of my judges said that when she first put on the robe, she was just like, oh my God, I'm the face of justice, right? Like, but that's kind of is part of what we're looking for. We're looking for the face of justice. And so I think the idea, again, in my view, is rooted in some very outdated ideas of emotion as being things that necessarily disrupt those democratic goods that we want. And I think it also showed a sort of almost, I'm about to use a word that sounds more offensive than I think it is, sort of infantilistic idea that the only way to project state authority is through an unreachable ideal. A famous legal realist writer in the 30s in the United States named Jerome Frank literally linked this to Freudianism. It was pretty out there, but he was like, this is literally the childish fantasy for the perfect parent. And I don't think he was wrong about that, actually. So the question, so that's my quick take on that. The question of what's better, I think it's better to see the human behind the robe and to own that this is what we're choosing to do. We are choosing to run a human-run system for reasons. This is actually really interesting because now, of course, judges are afraid that the robots are coming, because everyone's afraid the robots are coming, but they actually kind of are coming. And Chief Justice Roberts actually a few years ago wrote in his annual report to the judiciary, like actually literally sought to assure the federal judiciary of the United States of America that don't worry, we won't be replaced by robots because only human beings can really hear and understand and empathize with and, you know, show respect for human beings, and that's our currency. It was a shocking thing. It was like, wait, we're into emotion now? So I feel like that's the historical moment we're in. It's like, no, if we want to not be replaced by the robots, we have to own the humanity, and we have to turn that into our superpower. So, I don't know. What do you all think about that? I know you saw from the snippet I gave you of the book, you saw the thing about the robots.
Well, I think that this is a very valid, exactly the same thought is pervading also other institutions. For example, we have the debate about lethally autonomous weapons in war. And there has been the argument, well, it will violate the human dignity of the person who's killed by the robot because you have an entitlement to be killed by a human. So I think, I don't like that argument,
No.
but the general idea that emotions are an important part of what makes us human and therefore indispensable for judgment in the broadest sense, not only deciding a judicial case, but assessing political and social situations, I think that is I think that's intuitively very plausible, and I think it's a good argument against complete substitution by robots. But
yeah, I would also add that we can also ask, in reply to your question, not only where does it come from. Of course, it has become a central core of modernist ideologies and the idea what it means to be a modern self, means to be in control of one's emotion, but also, how it serves to stabilize existing hierarchies in modern society. And you have mentioned that also in your talk. And I think since at least the 70s, particularly feminist voices have said that there is an enormous critical power in acknowledging the role of emotions, because how this liberal modern idea of putting emotions aside serves also to marginalize people and to marginalize in patriarchal ways, because emotions are gendered, in colonial ways, because it's clear that you have certain societies, parts in the world that are not as rational as Europe is, and of course in terms of class, when you think about who is able to master one's emotions in an effective way. So also looking at emotion and there is a certain universalism about it. That is what you said in your talk, and many academics have seen it as a critical potential, also to criticize hierarchical inequalities that modern colonial capitalism has brought about.
Yeah, and I mean, just to lean in on the gender point for a moment too, I mean, when this idea of the dispassionate judge was stitching itself together, of course, there were no women judges, and, then we developed in the West a little bit later this, dichotomy between, men equal rationality, equal workplace, women equal warmth and emotion, equal home, and so things, nothing is ever happening, no idea is ever happening without a discursive dance, again, with all of these other social historical factors. But it's shifting now. I mean, a lot of things are shifting now. Not all for the good, I'm sure, but they are definitely shifting.
Thank you, first of all, for the amazing talk. My name is Lily Lohmann. I'm a law student here in Heidelberg. And my question would be about, first of all, the studies that you did, Mrs. Maroney, about civilian judges, if I recalled it correctly, because what would also be interesting is maybe the emotions of judges in the context of military law. So, for example, the courts martials in the US, and this is interesting both with national military courts, as they're a bit more prominent in the US or in the UK than in Germany, and also when dealing with violations of international law in armed conflict, which would be rather your topic, Mr. Benz. This is why I want to ask how the emotions of judges may have an impact on such more rigorous systems like the military, or how those microcultures may vary.
I would love, it's a wonderful question, like all of these so far, and I would love to know. So either I need to grow like 10 more people doing research like I do, which is actually what I would like to do. So if anybody wants to go down this path, please do. But that would be a wonderful thing to research. I've been exposed to it through a number of my students, because we have at Vanderbilt, we are one of the schools that takes students from the military who are training to become military officers, JAGs, we call them. And so they educate me a lot about the military system. And it's as you said, it's a wildly different system. So how will it, of course it's going to affect the emotions of the judges and the emotional and what they do with them. Like, it's impossible, given what I said here today, to think otherwise. So I would love to know. Check in with me in 10 years, or maybe somebody else is going to do that study, because maybe you will do that study. Will you do that study?
Maybe.
Okay.
We can talk about it.
Fantastic. Okay, good. I'll
Thank
read
you so
it.
much.
Yeah, I think that's, if I could add, because I'm thinking about this because when I was a kid, I watched, of course, because in the 90s, this was like the decade for it, of all these courtroom dramas in Hollywood, right? I had these John Grisham novels that were made into films, and we all watched A Few Good Men, I assume. At least if you're my age, you watch it. So it's a courtroom drama about a military court proceeding, and there are a few of those, actually. It's a very interesting genre, and interestingly, it's a US genre mostly, which has a lot to do, I think, with US culture and the legalism.
We also have a very large military. I'm not sure if you've heard.
Yeah. And of course, it must be clear without, I don't know any studies about that actually, but it's clear that when we are talking about these microcultures, there is, of course, a very different emotional culture inside the military. And I think these courtroom dramas convey that pretty well. You have to communicate in certain ways about it, because in the German translation of this film, A Few Good Men, eine Frage der Ehre, question of honor, you already see that that would be an example of what you talked about. What is honorable or not is is conceived very differently if you're a civilian or a soldier.
Definitely.
And I think there, these different emotion cultures also in different sectors of society would be crucial, I guess.
Yeah.
And now we know why you did your PhD.
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so thank you very, very much for your talk from my side as well. I'm Isabel Ivan. I studied German, English, and French law, and one point that was always missing for me in law studies was this question about psychological aspects, and that's why I started cognitive science later to explore these questions. And from that interdisciplinary aspect, I would like to ask, like, the whole panel's opinion. Psychotherapists have these supervision or intervision groups to not only discuss cases, but also like to have a way to discuss their emotions when how they're like dealing with being faced with so much trauma and problems. Like, what would you say about like establishing something like that in courts?
I have thoughts, but I also am not sure. Is this still on? Yes, okay. But I'll try to say it quickly, because I really would love to know what y'all think about that question. So this is actually being proposed in some places as part of the wellness move. I have a paper coming out about judicial wellness actions being taken in the United States, for what it's worth, probably sometime next year. But they've always been all of these kind of actions, like having a coach, having sort of a judicial supervisor, having free access to therapy, having this stuff is always just positioned as very marginal, completely voluntary, unless the judge is in serious disciplinary proceedings and is about to get kicked off the bench, and sometimes then he or she will consent to such things. So it's very much kind of on a sideline. I did recently read a paper with a proposal much along the lines that you're saying. I believe it is in Spain. This is not a thing that's happened, but was basically proposing that kind of model. And a lot of the concerns with that had to do with judicial independence and ethics and confidentiality. I mean, at least in the US, judges are so fiercely not just individualist, but independent, and would really, really have 8 million questions before they would ever consent to that. If I were queen of the world and I could take all that away, I think it's great. I think anything that could get them in a room, being reflexive, that's the function I try to serve for a lot of them when I do judicial retreats and seminars. But that's like one-offs, and they really need that, just like therapists, I think, kind of all the time. So this is another fun. I'm sorry I said I'd be short, but keep going back to Daniel, the one about it's confusing what you're supposed to do with the emotions. And he said, he was like, I'm not in favor of standing around with my colleagues, in a circle and talking about our feelings all the time. We got work to do here. And then he was like, but a little bit of that would not be bad either. So I think maybe if it was voluntary, I think the problem is the people who need those things the most are the ones who do it the least. So, sorry, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there are two things that come to my mind. The first is when I listen to your stories, Terry, it's also that obviously these judges have some ways of doing the emotional labor required for their job. Not in these formal settings of going to a supervisor or psychological therapy or something, but they have ways of maybe even talking to each other, and maybe it would also be interesting to really look in detail. I mean, what mechanisms are already there for these people to deal with the emotions that they have. And I would assume there's another problem here that I would also, and I think we can all see that, I mean, when we are thinking of court as something that is so emotionally exhausting for all participants, when I would be a judge, and I sometimes feel like this as a professor too, that, I mean, for example, it's enormously stressful for the students, right, to be at university. Of course, it's also stressful for me, but I also would have certain moral reservations to say, well, I'm the one who needs therapy here, right? Not the defendant, right? Or these jury members who have never, done this in their whole lives, or the lawyers who have under this constant pressure. So I would assume there's also probably a moral hesitancy of people to say, well, I'm so vulnerable.
I think it's more of an ego hesitancy, actually. Okay. But what's the moral hesitancy? Like, why should I have when they don't have access? Is that what you're saying?
Maybe not also to make it about them, right? I mean, it's not, when you sit through a criminal trial with these terrible things like sexual violence, then, I mean, would you then really say, this is so terrible for me here as a judge, right? I think probably it's a very difficult role conflict, and not only...
I do think it's, to be like, I'm also just a human in the room. Again, it's sort of, it kind of goes back to your question about, like, where did we get so invested in this idea of the judge being one thing, face of justice, right? That's the role conflict. You have to be simultaneously the face of justice and just another human being in the room. And I think that's a layer of complexity that judges are not encouraged to engage in.
Yeah, but I think what you're after is that the judge is in a privileged position in comparison to all the others who are worse off. But I think we have one more question.
Yes, one last question over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Nina. I'm a researcher in international public law. I have a brief question. If there is a practice among the judges to reflect on their own decisions, especially those that, in their opinion, have been made under high emotional pressure, and if they recognize such emotional pressure that could affected on their rulings, and of course there might be some individual judges who recognize that and reflect on their decisions, but I wonder if there is a common approach among the judges, collective approach, to admit that, to admit effects on emotions or their judgments, and then maybe consider that in their future work.
No. So the reason I'm saying that, so it's a wonderful question. The reason I'm saying it that way is that there is no practice. I'm sort of reacting to the common practice. No, I think, that, again, this is what happens when we don't train people to think that this is part of your job, that having emotions and handling them and interrogating them is not orthogonal to your work. It's actually integral to your work. Is those habits are not cultivated to the extent that I would say there's a practice. I can tell you a lot of things judges do, right? I can tell you that there is a judge who told me that, the way she does that is she has a bit of a long drive from her courthouse back home, and she says every evening in the car she does what she calls taking my measure. She says, I just take my measure, and I don't listen to NPR. I don't listen to an audiobook. I just think through each case in the day, and I reflect on how I felt and how I did. And by the time I get home, I've sort of taken my measure. I can tell you about judges who run marathons, who have lots of self-reflection going on their long runs. So I can tell you about a lot of judges who go home and talk to their spouses while they're walking the dog and take their measure that way. So I think what I have, again, this is sort of the logic of discovery. What I have now is I have a set of practices, but I do not think I could tell you that there is a practice or any kind of center of gravity there. But it's, yeah, it's a very, very good question.
I think you, Professor Peter, should have the last word.
Yeah, okay, I have a role conflict here. Thank you very much, Professor Maroney, dear Terry, for this wonderful, inspiring and also entertaining and eye-opening talk, which I think was addressed both to the specialist and to the interested layperson, like more or less like me. And thank you for coming all the way with Deutsche Bahn from Hamburg on time. So thanks a lot.